if we could just mute ourselves and turn our cameras off, so that we could get a sort of clear bit of screen here. Could everybody do that, please?
Morning, Mike. Slight technical hiccup there, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Daniel.
Perfect. There we go. Always good to have a bit of technology problems as you start. Fantastic, but we're all there, I think. Polly, are you all set from your end?
Yeah, all good to go.
Perfect. All right. Okay, so have you muted all, Polly, from your side, just to confirm?
Confirm I've done that, yes.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Bro. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending where you've joined. Obviously, absolute pleasure, and thank you ever so much for joining the webinar, between Aegaea and Storm Geomatics. My name is Daniel Cook. I'm one of the principal consultants at Aegaea, who will be talking you through kind of the subject title, which is taking data to action and enhancing your flood risk assessment with intelligent survey data. We also have Mike Hopkins joining us as well on the webinar today, who is Director of Storm Geomatics, a surveying company that support us in producing that data into our models and producing information and data sets that we can then go on to use. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you all about this morning, and quite relevant, particularly in the United Kingdom at the moment, is the flood in the news. Now, the last winter just gone in 2023, we had Storm Babette, we had Storm Kieran, and it's been an exceptionally wet winter, as records are starting to come through, more and more reports are starting to come through on that wet winter. Now, to put it into some perspective, 2,200 homes were affected just with Storm Babette, with over 150 rivers recording high water levels. Now, the importance of that is obviously that we notice that these trends are happening, that the climate change, the influences, the modelling, the intensity of those storms is happening much more frequently. So what are we doing about that? Now, the action that's being mitigated was that back in 2021, there was a programme of works implemented by the government over a 6-year capital investment programme that investing, should I say, 5.2 billion into new flood defence projects. Now, it got off, unfortunately, to a relatively slow start in terms of pulling through those defences and those applications and defences. But the relevance of this is that the intention was that we would provide those defences to provide better protection for up to around 336,000 homes. The reality is at this moment in time that we're around about the 200,000 mark, and they reckon that that's kind of the forecast that we're going to work with all the way through to 2027. Fingers crossed it will change, but that's kind of where we are at this moment in time. Now, one of the big relevances of that data set that we're looking at, and also those statistics, is that one of the big things that informs all of that information is that we need good data capture and good models. Now, the rationale behind that is by producing those hydraulic models to a greater representation, greater accuracy, better data capture, we're much more able to identify those areas which are at high risk of flooding, the type of mitigation or defences that are needed, and better inform that design. We're able then to take data, turn it into information, and make informed decisions and solutions in the real world. Now, one of the other big things that came out of a recent report from National Audit Office was that actually with the way that we're capturing data now and the accuracies that exist and the way we're able to better represent the real world, we found that from 2021 into 2022-23, that the increase in properties affected was up by 500,000, 500,000. So most of us have been used to that number for the last few years of 5.2 million properties being at risk in England alone, but we're now up to 5.7. And the infographic on the other side shows where those sources of flooding are coming from, and also the impacts it has on infrastructure as well. That is quite an amazing statistic and shows just the power that good data capture has and the impact it has in our real world scenarios, and that informing our decision making as we go. So just without me obviously taking full mic responsibilities, what I'd like to do is introduce Mike Hopkins of Storm Geomatics to just explain a bit more about who Storm Geomatics are, and also the areas that they're going to cover this afternoon collaboratively with Aegaea in terms of the services they provide and how the collaboration works between the two of us. So Mike, if you don't mind introducing yourself and who you are and what you do, that'd be great.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, Mike Hopkins, Managing Director of Storm Geomatics. Really good couple of intro slides there. 5.7 million properties at risk of flooding. Now, how many people does that displace? You know, that could be 10 million people, and it's really, you know, although we measure the properties, it's the people that live in them that are going to suffer. So it's a big problem, and it's something that I've been working on for all my career, really. I surveyed my first river in 1992 at the age of 23. So I'm giving away my age there. And I did post-flood levelling after that great flood of 1997. And that was the first time I saw a tree with a caravan lodged in the top of it. And since that flood, there's been quite a demand really for more flood risk mapping and modelling. And I've been involved in a lot of that since then. And in 2006, one of my colleagues and I decided to set up Storm Geomatics to try and streamline the process of capturing data, to streamline the process of presenting data, and understanding flood modelling more deeply, so that we could integrate our data straight into hydraulic modelling systems. So that's really our job as Storm Geomatics, is to capture the data and present it in a way that is usable.
Fantastic. No, thanks ever so much, Mike. Yeah, it's obviously with the work that Aegaea do in flood modelling, we do have close ties with Storm Geomatics, and just on screen is just showing you some of the ways in which the data is captured by Storm. We will elaborate on this as we go through the webinar with the technologies that exist, best practices as well, to kind of explain how we capture that data and how we start to build those robust models to inform planning, infrastructure, design across a wide range of sectors, because it's much more prevalent now to know whether you're at risk of flooding, and obviously all the things that Mike has just identified as well in terms of the impact it has on populations across the United Kingdom, but also how some of these techniques could be taken elsewhere internationally as well to promote those best practices. So if we take it to an England, United Kingdom sort of view, but much more focused to England, what are those first steps that we need to identify and recognise when a surveyor might be required and when a consultant's required as well? So we look at the site location, we assess kind of whether it's next to rivers, where the rivers are, seas, what the source of flooding is ultimately. We look at those flood zones that you could find yourself in, and then from there we start to we ask more questions. It's ingrained into a consultant to ask more questions. So where does the data come from? What do those flood levels look like? How much risk is there? And we start to unpick what that image is showing us on the left to start actually transferring it into information and those design criteria that we talked about as well earlier. We also have the ability within England that we can request product 5, 6, and 7, which are model files, and allow us to sort of interrogate and review the models if potentially we want to check more of a source of flooding, the mechanisms, time steps, etc. But when a surveyor becomes required is in that last step, that when we do like a health check of a model. So within that process, we take the model on, we review it, we look at the modelling decisions that were made by another consultant potentially, look at the age of the model, the hydrology. Is it relevant to where we are now? Can we use that model to inform a design at this stage, or do we need to go back out, capture more data because things have changed, landscapes changed, environments changed, which have not been represented when the model was first built. And there are some models out there that exist that are sort of 5, 10 plus years old. So there is the need every now and then to go back in and update those models where required. Or in some instances, there are areas in England where there is no modelling, and so we do need to go out and get the surveys to build and represent the modelled extents that could exist in those locations. So one of the big parts, and pass back to Mike on this, is obviously when we need a surveyor. Obviously, the big thing for us is no data, old data, and outdated data, as I say. So it's a data capture for us is absolutely massive and a very vital part of informing the decision making. I think, Mike, you're in full agreement with this as well in terms of obviously how we capture that data and the techniques that have advanced over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a post on LinkedIn only the other day reviewing some hydraulic cross-section data for hydraulic modelling, and it said rubbish in, rubbish out, and it's absolutely right. You know, if you don't pick up the features on a river that are sensitive to the model, then your model outcome is going to be incorrect, and therefore the decisions you make about that site are going to be incorrect. And you know, it's only by understanding modeling and you know, that collaboration that we get to know how to build models, how to build modeling units, and what is sensitive when we're out there to your end of the job.
No, absolutely. No, quite right, Mike. And thanks, obviously, for adding on that extra piece. It was an interesting article by one of our other sectors, people in the sector. So thank you for sharing that. One of the big things for us, though, was obviously we've identified the site. We now know it's at risk. We now need a surveyor. It all sounds quite easy. It's quite a streamlined process, but there's a lot of work that's gone behind the scenes with focus to that. And I just wanted to kind of share with you kind of all the background elements that compartmentalize, and I'll get the word out eventually, in terms of how we sort of bring it all together between surveyor and consultant. So we start the story obviously by identifying the site is in need of a flood risk assessment or flood model information. We then start to look at, well, what policies apply based on the type of development or work that the client wants to do in that location. We then start to pull through the surveyor elements. We identify that we need a surveyor, so we need the national spec, and an understanding of that specification as well is vitally important. We then need to get the right licenses, the right equipment, the right safety to make sure that the team can get there. And then we pull it back again into policy, making sure that once we have that information, what policies apply. It's a disparate landscape when it comes to policy. Every regional area has different boundaries, different councils have different legislation within reason. So we then need to update ourselves on that. And that all comes part of the service, part of the package between consultant and surveyor. There's more guidance that comes through, new technologies that come through, policy again, risk assessments to make sure that people are operating safely when out on site, lessons learned, courses to make sure that procedures are actioned when emergencies do happen. Land access is a massive issue and something that we now need to address more and more when we want to capture data, and understandably from those landowners. And then finally, one other element that probably doesn't get looked at as much is obviously the vegetation clearance and invasive species. All of these come together behind the scenes, as it were, to make sure that that data is captured correctly, efficiently, and then processed into informing the client of whether a site does or does not flood and the impacts it will have. So one of the big things of this webinar this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending where you are, was to capture 5 key practices, key good soft skills that you can take into your businesses when you're working on your projects, in terms of bringing those lessons learned that we have had over the years, and so to Storm, to better improve the sector. So I'll pass over to Mike to expand a bit more on kind of point 1 and collaboration and communication.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. You know, this has been the key for our business really since we started in 2006. Like I said in the beginning, we set out to understand our clients' businesses and how they worked and the technicalities of hydraulic modelling, and you know, doing that on a whole sort of business scale is very different to an individual site, but it's just as important, because when we actually get onto site on an individual basis, we can often do a site walk. It doesn't happen every time, but if you do a site walk on the site, we can discuss various features on the river and discuss how we're going to survey them, how we're going to present them to the modeler, and make sure that, you know, we're also looking at the flood map to see if there's any areas that need extra attention, like there could be low points in the bank, stuff like that, which could be hidden by vegetation, as you could see in that photograph there at the time of the sidewalk. But we'll have a look at and we'll measure to make sure that those kind of things are included in the model, so that we do get the best outcome for the flood outline, which will give you the developable area, and or also it splits into flood zones 1, 2, and 3. And without this kind of collaboration and understanding of not only hydraulic modeling but the site itself, you will not get the answers with the integrity that you would if you do that collaboration and communication first.
Absolutely. I think one of the key words to use there, I'd say, Mike, is purpose when it comes to collaboration and communication. Understanding that purpose of the survey, and then the importance of all of those things that you've just mentioned, assets, features, walkovers, in order to capture that information. Because going back to your point at the very beginning, if we don't capture that data correctly, the purpose is that maybe a residential development does go in, and if an asset's not been well represented or underrepresented, there's a risk that that could then become a source of flooding or contribute to flooding onto a new development. So that ties nicely, I feel, in terms of that preparation. So how do we go about capturing that data, preparing for that site survey, that site walkover, early doors? Obviously, a lot of technology now exists. Data is easily accessible, Google Earth and other sources, DEFRA open platform. So again, Mike, could you just kind of expand for us and the audience to sort of show some of the steps that your team take in terms of preparing for a survey and understanding the risks that they might be exposed to?
Yeah, preparation is something that, you know, our team have really focused on in the last probably 5 years. I mean, you know, years ago you used to get a brown envelope with a site in the night before you went, and you just went with a letter of authority, you know, with Water Resources Act 1991 on, and that would get you in anywhere. But now we do our own access arrangements. We have a system with Land Registry where we contact landowners, and we do letter drops. We make sure we have access to the river before we go, because you can go on some of these jobs and be turned away. If a landowner doesn't want you there, you have to apologize and leave. So things like that, that's just one of the things that we need to do, and we're very good at that, and we're very quick at it, because the guys that want to get on us, we've got it in our schedule, therefore we want to get those access arrangements cleared, so that we can get on and get your data to you and you can get your project moving. All sorts of other things influence how we go about a job and how we prepare for it. Things like the flow velocity. Can we stand up in that river? Would our 6 horsepower boat hold the current? You know, is it better to use a hydrone, which is a radio controlled boat? So depth, again, can we wade it? Sky visibility, is it in a valley? You know, has it got tree canopy through it? You know, so you have to take the right tools for the job, and certainly in the UK we have a very varied topography, and you know, a huge, you know, something like 16 or is it 18 classifications of different types of river, depending on gradient, sinuosity, all that kind of thing, and they all lend themselves to different kind of approaches. And you know, there are so many uncertainties when you actually get to a river, that you don't really know if the method you've picked is going to work, but you can guarantee if you've done your preparation right, it's got the highest chance of success. If you look at the picture there, there's a guy, he's set up way above the river with a base station, because in that particular river valley there was no phone signal, and you need signals to come back and forwards to your surveying equipment to get your accurate position and height. Therefore, we took extra sensors to create base stations to transmit from where we could get a signal at the top of the hill down into the valley bottom there. So lots of things to think about, lots of resources to do preparation from, Google Earth, rainfall information, live gauge station readings so that we can see what the weather's doing, what the river levels are like, whether we mobilize. So there's so much you can do in preparation, and it's something that we found is very valuable to keep projects on track.
Absolutely. No, and it goes twofold. Obviously, going back to this collaboration and communication piece that we mentioned at the beginning, as Mike's identified, once they know the site and where they're going, they can start to look at all of those features that play part in assessing what equipment is correct and all the procedures that they need to put in place. But it starts ultimately from us as surveyor and our walkovers, identifying those features, those assets, the inflow points, and pulling together that specification, as you can see here, saying, hi, look, these are the rivers that we want to be focused. We believe that these are the assets that need to be looked at. Can you now go away and sort of pull that together? The more information you're able to feed the surveyor at the beginning of the process, the better it is for you as a modeler, because you then have the work back, the timeframes on the projects as well, and that importance of managing client relationships and project programs. Obviously, if we underspec something, if we miss an asset, that all results in higher costs, resurvey work, potentially even worst case, you've built the model and then it's identified there's an asset later in the system that we need to capture. That then needs to be resurveyed. That has an impact on the way in which the flood mechanisms happen. There's redesign. It's all time, it's all cost. And there's also that mental bearing on it as well that comes with those delays, the meetings that all come out of it. So getting it right first time, putting all that information in really early on and being clear on what the purpose and the requirements are is massively advantageous between both obviously surveyor and consultant, because ultimately and bottom line, nobody wants to do a rubbish job. So
can I just add to that,
absolutely,
Daniel? Yeah, because often, even after the site walk and even after, all the preparation's done, it's not till sometimes that you're in the channel surveying it that you can see features of hydraulic significance that have been missed. So if you have inexperienced surveyors, doing these surveys for you, they could quite easily miss these critical features that could be the difference between a development flooding and not. So, a lot of these assets and features aren't actually mapped, and you are leaving it down to the eyes on the ground, which is your surveyor, to pick that up so it reflects in the model.
No, it ties nicely though, Mike, as what you were saying in terms of that experience and that training. Obviously, the Storm are very specialist in what they do and they provide in terms of those channel surveys, and with it have years of experience in pulling through those other hydraulic features and that we can see and pull through into the model and inform the models that we have. But also going with it, there's the training programs that you have internally and having dedicated training programs as well. I mean, one of the big ones from yourselves is obviously supporting with the DEFRA water safety training, if I'm right, and making sure that all the team have the appropriate training. Do you mind just sort of expanding on the importance? I think you've obviously captured it at the beginning, but just to kind of re-emphasize why that dedicated surveyors to dedicated services is so important.
Yeah, well, it deserves it, because if you work for a multidisciplinary survey company as a surveyor and you're surveying a river 1 minute, a road the next, a railway the next, what you become is kind of okay at all those things. But if you specialize in one thing, you become an absolute expert in it, and you really benefit from that, both from a safety point of view, a quality of data point of view, and mentally as well, you know what you're doing. You're not doing something different every day to try and work out what you're doing. So the internal training program promotes people within that have the right level of competencies as well. So it's a competency thing that they're tested on, and they move up a level gradually at a time, so that they're always confident in their ability to do their job. And it's so nice to be in a company that is able to focus on one thing and invest in one thing to get the best out of it, really.
No, and I think obviously from the conversation we were having the other day, one of the big things plays, and it's that data capture point at the beginning of our conversation in terms of, or the webinar, should I say, in terms of that data capture is now so advanced that we're better able to capture data. And I think you were mentioning the other day that there's potentially a new technology coming through that can penetrate through the water potentially. I think that would be really useful for the audience to sort of have knowledge of that's on its way potentially.
Yeah, I mean the technology is brilliant. You know, in 1993 when I started, you know, computers weren't all that powerful. Survey equipment wasn't that great, and things were slow. But as we've moved on, the power of computers is really climbing steeply now, and we were able to capture more data faster and more accurately. And just when you think a technology has peaked, like GNSS or GPS, as most people know it, you know, just when you think it's peaked, you squeeze everything out of it you can. They'll bring something else out that will survey points under trees, for instance. So, you know, it just keeps giving, this technology, and you have to invest in it to get the most to move to reduce flooding, really, and because you're getting more data, and this is what this is all about. It's about the resolution of data that we're capturing now. Some of these sensors that you see flashing in front of you can capture, you know, 250,000 points a second, and you know, that's a lot of data. But again, you've then got to invest in the software and the training to be able to interpret that data and make it usable for your client.
No, and that's where, again, it's that picking the right surveyors and having well qualified consultants as well in terms of being able to process that data once it comes in. One of the other aspects of obviously Storm's work and your years of expertise in this sector is that you do have a software package called GeoRiver, which makes that transfer of data much easier for consultants compared to sort of having to work through the .csv files and pull it all through and all the rest in terms of the cross sections and more. So again, Mike, just again, for those that don't know about the other additional internal secrets or softwares that you have at Storm, do you mind just quickly expanding on GeoRiver and how that helps consultants?
So GeoRiver basically takes geospatial data, organizes it, and churns it out in drawings, which can be interpreted by human beings, but also hydraulic modeling data files that can go into all the different modeling packages. And we've developed this software in-house. So we've actually gone to the hydraulic modeling companies or software companies to understand exactly how that works, which has given us even more information on what is required on site. So that creates time efficiencies, but it also creates higher quality because there are less manual errors in the transfer of the geospatial data into the hydraulic model.
Also removes a few pain points as well from a consultant perspective, which is always well appreciated when it comes to building out the models, because they are complex. So any sort of support we can get, it certainly helps. Which ties on nicely to the last point, which is those accuracy of the outputs. If you pull those four things together that we've just talked about, the collaboration, the preparation, latest technologies, dedicated training programs, having experienced consultants and surveyors in that data capture, recognizing what's important, then the accuracy of the outputs are much more reliable, much more representative, and give us much more confidence in that baseline data to then start making decisions, optioneering ideas, potentially if we're doing river restoration, or if we're looking at potentially infrastructure that's been built and is now needing more further investigation because it's becoming exposed to floods. These are all elements, all pieces of data that we need in that collaboration piece between the two to pull it all together. Now, before obviously we conclude and move on to questions, it's always useful to see how this comes into practice. So what I thought we would do is just cover off a very quick case study, very quick indeed, just mindful of time, and then some questions that will come through. Is that Aegaea were approached to support a landowner. As you can see, it's in flood zone 3, dark blue. The EA main river is identified running through. There is flood zone 2 there as well, but a large area of that plot is affected by a flood zone, which limits what you can do, and obviously the need to understand the flood risk assessment requirements set out by the Environment Agency and the NPPF. With it, obviously at least 25%, just under 5 hectares of the site was affected, so roughly 25% of the land area was affected. And we looked at that and thought, there's probably more we can do here. Let's start to do that delving, asking questions, get the product through. Let's have a look at the model files, which then became really interesting. So it was a project that we worked on a couple of years ago. If we look at the dates, 2018, 2024. So in terms of obviously that model, it was produced back in 2004. So at the time it was 14 years old back in 2018. The sampling data wasn't fantastic, the way the cross sections were captured. We sought to improve the capture of that topographic survey, the spatial setting of the cross sections as well as then looking at the elevations, which weren't known at that point in that model. Like I say, it was quite an old model. And then obviously there's the peak flows, the hydrographs. We looked at redoing the hydrology, and then we took it forward from technology at the time. And this is no disservice to the Environment Agency. These things happen, times moves on. So we started to then build that model out in Flood Modeler Pro and 2Flow. Just to kind of give some perspective of the update to the topography, at least, and the elevation along the river, you can see with the red that it's much more representative of what we would expect to see in a landscape, highs and low points, as opposed to sort of a straight line, which doesn't really happen unless we've covered it in tarmac. And even then, it's got its ups and downs. So what were the impacts of bringing that forward? Now, as we showed earlier, at least 25% of the site was affected, but by improving the modelling techniques, improving that data capture, having that experience, that knowledge, we were able to take all of that and bring it into a format that started to show that in this occasion, actually the flooding at this location was not as significant as first thought due to the poor data capture. So it actually went reverse of kind of all the conversation we've had, but it can go the other way as well. We then started to look at the sequential approach and kind of where we allocate development. We're just looking at this from a where can things go master plan sort of layout. So we'll move the more vulnerable residential development outside of the flood zones, obviously factoring that access and egress would be something we consider as part of a flood risk assessment as well, and so too drainage, but there's only so much time we can cover in this webinar, but maybe another time. We then started to look at the less vulnerable developments that we bring forward, so our shops, our office spaces. We then started to look at the water compatible uses, so our sports pitches, which if they flood, yes, it's an inconvenience, but in terms of risk to life and support mechanisms and those buildings needing to be functioned, reduced. So we started through that to make better informed decisions due to that data capture and better technologies being used and software to inform our client of the options that became available to them. Quite an interesting case study. I appreciate it was very quick, but it just kind of shows how important it is to get that data capture right so early on. That brings us through, believe it or not, through our sort of quick introduction of obviously the importance of a surveyor, so to a consultant, and having the right qualified consultants and qualified surveyors on your project. Mike, did you have anything to add before we sort of move over to questions at all?
Well, I just to reiterate the possibilities and the future of data really, and how it has made a difference, how it's made a difference to the numbers of people at risk of flooding in your early slides, but also how it makes a difference to individual sites when you're planning. So, you know, the density of data is important, and you know, you see people on LinkedIn saying, well, I can walk around a site and I can tell you where it's going to flood, and I can, you know, especially when you go in a flood, I don't need a survey. But actually you're not going to get anywhere with that. You do need the data. You do need to do scenario testing, model predicting, flood predicting, sorry. And I think the further we go, the better the information, that actually the value of the data is becoming far better with it, because you're getting more for less. And actually the outcomes that you get, the money you spend on this, you save on, or you make somewhere else, because you make better decisions.
No, absolutely. I think that's really a key point, again, to sort of, just before we wrap up, is, as you mentioned, sort of the ability to capture more area than we ever have before at sort of a reduced cost. Obviously, we have used things like IFSAR and LiDAR in the past, but now you can have your own drone survey to cover those large areas, which potentially were done by man, or even sort of aeroplane, helicopter, in order to sort of capture those large areas. Whereas now we can do it sort of by remote vehicles, which is a lot cheaper, it's a lot more accessible. So it definitely has its advantages, and those advantages can only be good, not just for the work that we do and the information that we transfer, but the recipients of that data, and turning that into information to better inform not just residential schemes, but essential infrastructure, defences, and making sure that society is better prepared for flooding as and when it does unfortunately happen. It is natural. So no, thank you ever so much, Mike, for your time, and obviously thank you everybody for your attendance at the webinar. I hope there was some useful points in that discussion piece. I think, Polly, if we pass over to you, or potentially Nick, have there been any questions coming through, or which we have been asked?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in. I guess firstly, thanks both. I think it was really insightful to hear about the importance of data, really, and I think the bit that you mentioned at the end, Dan, about accessibility of data as well, and sort of improving that for everyone moving forward as technology improves is really important. Yeah, we've got a few questions, some in the chat and some have come through sort of directly previously prior to the webinar. A few of them are kind of linked, so I'll kind of badge the ones that are linked kind of together, I guess. First one that I will mention, so this is from an anonymous person. Can you briefly discuss the working principle of technology employed in an FRA? So I guess how does the importance of technology and modelling inform an FRA that we would produce as a consultancy? I guess there's one for you, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, that technology that, say, Storm Geomatics or other surveyors capture pulls through survey data, channel profiles, which then go into the hydraulic model. That hydraulic model is then supported by hydrologists that capture the flows of a catchment, that's the inflows into the river. And then from there, we're able to determine a range of scenarios, storm events, we can call them that as well, that look at the requirements for planning. So 1 in 30 flood zone 3B, 1 in 100 looking at sort of a flood zone 3 extent, obviously with climate change as well, and then obviously your 1 in 1,000 are the sort of the main criteria ones that we look at. Obviously flood zone 2 does leach between the two, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, and that's just focused to fluvial flooding. But if we focus it more so just to that design flood level and the guidance that exists, that's the importance of the data capture that exists from surveyors, is that the more relevance and more accurate that is, we're better able to determine the flows, better able to look at the representation and the mechanisms of how that water is effectively working in the channel, but also once it comes out of bank as well, and where it goes and how we then inform the designs, but most importantly, that 1 in 100 plus CC flood level. And we take that to support and understand where areas flood, finished floor levels, whether it increases flood risk elsewhere, access egress. It's a real pivotal piece to informing that flood risk assessment. And the greater confidence we have in the survey data, the greater confidence we have in the modelling outputs, as well as obviously all the other bits that go in, as I've just mentioned, your hydrology, etc., and then the interpretation from a qualified consultant. Hopefully that answers the question. So
yeah, that's probably a lot more detail than I was expecting you to give. So yeah, nice one, thank you. So yeah, these other ones are kind of badged, I guess, together. It's ultimately, I guess, on the topic of data gaps, so gaps in the data and how that can impact the work. So Mike asked one in the chat that says, sometimes in the field there are areas which are unsafe to survey at the time you encounter them. If there was a section of watercourse that was unreachable but it's documented in other ways, for example historical photos, what challenges does this present as a modelling team, and what is available to them in that instance? I guess it's kind of a bit of both for both of you.
Yeah, well, for us, you know, there are, you know, safety first, data later. Absolutely right. And if you can't get in, you go away, you do a risk assessment, and you might come back with a different method. You might come back mob-handed with people, different boats, different that. We'll do everything we can to get that data, because the data set is incomplete without it, and you are making assumptions. What happens is the modeler will interpolate between the last section you got and the next one downstream to fill in that gap. But it's an interpolation. It's not actually true to what's out there. So yes, there are you can interpolate. You can move sections slightly as well, as long as you get the cross section spacing fairly consistent. You can move cross-section locations, but ultimately, if you can't get in, you can't do it. It'll be interpolated between the up and downstream sections. So make sure those are representative of what's in between.
Yeah, I think Nick, Mike's covered it off from our side as well. Obviously, the way that we would do it is obviously that interpolation and just having that confidence again in the data and the right methods taken to find the most pragmatic approach, safest approach, but also the approach that gives us confidence in the output as well. So again, going back to our 5 points, that communication aspect and understanding the purpose of the survey and the need from both sides.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you both. Yeah, one of the other ones was, what are the impacts of missing assets in a model? I guess it goes back to what Mike was saying about the interpolation. I think obviously interpolating on a fairly generic or similar river reach where the cross sections are similar, interpolation works well. I guess the impact is obviously greater when there are assets or culverts or bridges or what have you that are missed. Obviously, yeah, as Mike said, trying the hardest to get the data is obviously key. I guess, Dan, this one's probably for you. It's probably going to be the last one given the time. How do you know if a model is of poor quality and or outdated, I guess, and sort of missing certain assets like culvert information, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, culvert information can only be done once you have walked the site or reviewed the model. So that's where it becomes very important to do sort of site walkovers, particularly with modelling jobs, or where we feel there are concerns. Obviously, Google Earth can help with that, but it doesn't replicate sort of boots on the ground. So if we do have any uncertainties that maybe a culvert's not been captured properly, then obviously that will send us to go to site. Or if we just feel that the data is maybe not where it needs to be, then we'll go to site. The other aspects that you were talking about in terms of obviously we had go to site, and what was the other bits on there? Sorry, Nick, just to cover off. What were the other bits on there?
Yeah, no, so it was just in terms of the model itself. How do we know the model itself misses?
Yeah, the accuracy and no, fine, okay, memory back in. Obviously with the hydrology, generally hydrology that's 10 years old should require review. Techniques move on. There are also practices out there that recommend that obviously hydrology should be sort of updated. So that is one of the indicators that obviously the model is old. Generally speaking, you should look at that and update it. Obviously, the other thing is that if you're well aware, so there is down outside Gatwick, the railway line went in, and there is a historic floodplain that goes through there. It's mapped flood zone 2, but obviously that was mapped when the railway line wasn't there. So we're talking sort of 40, 60 years ago, but it just gives you some kind of perspective that the environment change could happen. And therefore we're aware that the wider data is not as representative as it should be, and that then triggers us to obviously go back in and do the modelling, because it will impact the way the mechanisms of that water and where it goes. So there's just a few bits: hydrology, age of model, and then as part of that health check, if we've got one or too many questions on it, then we'll look at the site surveys or walkovers to confirm that the model is as accurate as it says it is.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, well done. Yeah, no, that covers all the questions that we've probably got time for. So yeah, thank you very much, both. Really insightful.
Thank you ever so much to everybody that attended. And if there are any questions that you have for Mike or I, or you have any other queries, our email address is there to send through. And I'm sure Mike, speaking on your behalf, but please do jump in. You'd be more than happy, or your wider team, to answer any of those questions.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for everybody for attending and listening, and I hope you found it both interesting and useful for going forward in your own jobs and careers.
Pleasure. Well, thank you ever so much, everybody. Polly, if you would like to end the session, then we'll wrap up. Thank you ever so much.
Yes,
Thank
I will
you.
do that now.
Thank you.
Thank you.